A single sentence crosses a decrypt desk in a windowless basement at Pearl Harbor in the third week of May, 1942. It is not stolen from a safe. It is not smuggled out by an agent. It is a routine Japanese naval message, only partly broken, and it says that an outpost designated AF is running short of fresh water. Nobody in that room needs to be told what AF is. They already know. They engineered the sentence themselves. 4 days earlier, on direct instruction from the base commander at Midway Atoll, a radio operator had sent an uncoded message to nobody in particular. The island's saltwater distillation plant has failed. It was a lie. The plant was fine. The message was bait, dropped into the open air for one specific set of ears more than 4,000 miles away in Tokyo. Tokyo had taken it, and had said so in its own traffic. AF is short of water. This is not a story about a lucky guess. Better ships did not decide what happened next. Braver pilots did not decide it. Numbers did not decide it. The United States did not have the numbers. This is a story about a trap that was built, patiently and expertly, to close on the United States Navy, and about the handful of men who read its blueprints before it was ever sprung, and quietly rebuilt it, aimed the other way, around the fleet of the man who had drawn it. The popular version of the Battle of Midway is a story about dive bombers. 4 days, 4 Japanese aircraft carriers, and a sudden reversal in the Pacific War, delivered, so the story usually goes, by daring, good timing, and no small amount of luck. That version is not wrong. It is simply incomplete. It begins the story on June the 4th, at the moment the bombs already had somewhere to fall. The more interesting story begins weeks earlier, in a doctrine so confident in itself that its architects never seriously entertained the possibility that their enemy already knew what they intended to do, and roughly where, and roughly when, before their carriers had even cleared home waters. Isoroku Yamamoto did not design Midway as a fair fight. He designed it as an ambush, with the island itself functioning less as a target than as a lure, meant to draw the last of the American carriers out of Pearl Harbor and into a battle Japan's Navy had spent 2 decades preparing to win. What Yamamoto did not know, and what his staff never seriously weighed as a possibility, was that the trap had already been read, fragment by fragment, before his fleet left port. To understand how completely that single fact changed the outcome, you have to go back, not to May of 1942, but to the doctrine that had shaped the Imperial Japanese Navy's entire theory of how a war against the United States could be won at all. From the 1920s onward, Japanese naval planners built their fleet, training, and strategic culture around one idea: Kantai Kessen, the decisive battle. Japan, they reasoned, could never outproduce the United States in ships, steel, or oil. It could, however, lure the larger American fleet into a single annihilating engagement, on ground of its own choosing, and destroy it before American industrial power came fully online. Pearl Harbor was meant to open that war on Japan's terms. Midway, 5 months later, was meant to close it. Yamamoto himself was a more complicated figure than the doctrine he served. He had studied at Harvard and served as a naval attaché in Washington. He had told colleagues, more than once, that he could run wild against the Americans for 6 months to a year, and promised nothing beyond that. He was not a fanatic. He was a professional gambler who had done the arithmetic and did not love the answer it gave him. Once the decision for war was made, though, he committed to it completely, and Operation MI, launched in the last days of May 1942, was the most ambitious plan he ever built. 4 fleet carriers under Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo would strike Midway's defenses and destroy whatever American ships came to relieve it. A separate force would land troops on the atoll. A diversionary strike on the Aleutian Islands, off Alaska, was meant to split American attention. A line of submarines would take position north of Hawaii to warn of any American sortie from Pearl Harbor. It was, by 1942 standards, an intricate and formidable design. It depended on exactly one assumption: that the Americans did not know it was coming. On the other side of the Pacific, that assumption had already failed, not through a spy, not through a stolen document, but through years of unglamorous cryptanalytic labor, conducted by men working in shifts in a basement 2 decks below Pacific Fleet headquarters. The Navy's Combat Intelligence Unit, known inside the service as Station Hypo, had been chipping away at Japan's principal fleet cipher, designated JN-25, since before Pearl Harbor. Its commanding officer, Joseph Rochefort, was an unlikely figure for the role. He had no formal training as a cryptanalyst. He had taught himself the discipline over years of unglamorous staff postings. He had also spent 3 years living in Japan in the 1920s as a language officer, absorbing not just vocabulary but the rhythm of Japanese naval bureaucratic prose, the shape a routine order takes before you can read every word of it. Breaking a cipher number by number produces fragments. Understanding what the fragments mean requires someone who can finish the sentence the way the author would have finished it. By April of 1942, following the Doolittle raid on Tokyo, Japanese naval radio traffic increased sharply, handing Rochefort's team a far larger body of intercepted signal to work against. Station Hypo could not read JN-25 in full. Nobody could, that spring. What the unit could do, with growing speed, was read enough. Routing orders, fuel requisitions, unit designators, repeated across enough intercepts to triangulate intent even where whole sentences stayed dark. By early May, those fragments pointed at a single pattern, a major operation building against an objective the intercepts identified only by a two-letter designator, AF. Not everyone agreed on what it meant. In Washington, the Navy's Central Cryptanalytic Office, OP-20G, read many of the same intercepts and argued for a different target elsewhere in the Pacific, possibly Hawaii itself. The disagreement was not a minor bureaucratic footnote. If Nimitz sent his 3 available carriers to the wrong point on the map, Midway would fall, Japan's fleet would remain intact, and the United States would have nothing positioned to contest whatever came next. Rochefort's unit needed certainty, not a persuasive argument, and there was exactly one way to get it without asking Tokyo to confirm the answer directly. A member of Rochefort's staff, Captain Wilfred Holmes, proposed it. Midway would report a fabricated equipment failure over an insecure channel, in the clear, where any listening post could pick it up. If Japanese traffic then referenced a water shortage at AF, the argument in Washington was over. Within days, it was. Rochefort telephoned Edwin Layton, Nimitz's fleet intelligence officer, and said in words Layton preserved afterward, "I've got something so hot here it's burning the top of my desk." Layton had never heard him use that phrase before. Rochefort was not a man given to heat metaphors. He dealt in fragments and probabilities. That he reached for fire to describe what he was holding told Layton, before he had even read the intercept, how little room for doubt remained. What Nimitz did with that certainty is a story that starts, as these stories usually do, with the people standing in the room when the decision had to be made. Chester Nimitz was 57 that spring, and had held command of the Pacific Fleet for barely 5 months, having taken the post 10 days after Pearl Harbor, when the fleet he inherited was still burning at its moorings. He was not a flamboyant man. He was a methodical administrator, with a reputation for calm judgment. His contradiction, a cautious professional, forced into the single largest gamble of his career, staking nearly every carrier the Pacific Fleet possessed on intelligence he had no way to verify independently, and no time left to wait for confirmation. Isoroku Yamamoto was 58, Commander-in-Chief of Japan's combined fleet, and by any honest measure, the finest naval strategist his country produced in that war. His contradiction was quieter, and in some ways sharper, a man who doubted his nation could win a long war against American industry, who nonetheless built the single most audacious naval plan of the Pacific conflict, and staked it on an assumption of secrecy he had no way of confirming, because he had already lost it. Chuichi Nagumo, 55, commanded the 4-carrier striking force at the center of Yamamoto's plan, and he was, by the account of Japanese naval historians who studied the decision afterward, a poor fit for the job. He had spent his career in torpedo and cruiser warfare, not naval aviation, and Yamamoto's own staff had reservations about his grasp of carrier operations even as they handed him its most powerful strike force. Joseph Rochefort was 43, blunt, exhausted, and running an operation that barely existed on any organizational chart Washington fully respected. His contradiction would not become visible until after the battle was won. A man whose work decided a war, and whose own service was, within weeks, prepared to treat that work as someone else's to claim. Edwin Layton, Rochefort's friend since the two had served together in pre-war Japan, sat closer to Nimitz than any other intelligence officer in the Pacific. Nimitz had told him plainly what his job was: think like Yamamoto, and tell me what he intends. And Lieutenant Commander John Waldron, 41, commanded Torpedo Squadron 8, flying obsolete Douglas Devastators, his own pilots already understood, before a single mission, to be outmatched by the aircraft Japan would put in the air against them. His contradiction needs no elaboration. He led anyway. Think about what that would have felt like, to know your aircraft was already a generation behind before you had even sighted the enemy, and to fly toward him regardless, because the fleet needed his attention pulled down toward the water at any cost. On May 28, 1942, Nimitz sent Rear Admirals Raymond Spruance and Frank Jack Fletcher their operational orders. The order held a phrase that would outlive the battle itself. The two commanders were to be governed, Nimitz wrote, by the principle of calculated risk, avoiding exposure of their forces to a superior enemy, without good prospect of inflicting, as a result of such exposure, greater damage to the enemy. It was not a guarantee. It was permission to gamble, bounded by arithmetic. Nimitz positioned his three carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown, northeast of Midway, at a rendezvous point the Americans nicknamed Point Luck. They waited there, hidden, for a Japanese fleet that did not know they existed. At approximately 04:30 on June 4th, Nagumo's four carriers began launching aircraft against Midway, more than 100 in the first strike alone. It was executed competently. Midway's defenses were badly damaged, and it was, in hindsight, the first domino in a sequence Nagumo did not see coming. Standard Japanese carrier doctrine held half of each ship's air group in reserve, armed for ship-to-ship combat, in case an American task force appeared. At roughly 0700, a Japanese scout plane reported American surface ships to the east. At 0820, an amended report added the detail Nagumo needed least, what appears to be a carrier. He now faced a decision with no comfortable answer. His Midway strike force was returning, low on fuel, needing to land. His reserve aircraft were being rearmed, mid-deck, switching from torpedoes to land attack bombs and back again as new information arrived. Rather than launch an immediate, ragged strike, Nagumo chose to recover his returning aircraft first, refuel and rearm his full strike, and launch one concentrated blow. It was the reasonable decision. It was also the fatal one. 4 decades of Imperial Navy doctrine had no category for an enemy who had already read the operation order. Grant the Japanese fleet its veteran pilots. It does not explain what happened at 10:22. Grant it the superior Zero fighter. It does not explain what happened at 10:22. Grant it the finest carrier strike force in the Pacific. It does not explain what happened at 10:22. The deciding factor was a 2-letter code word, broken in a basement, that meant Nagumo was steaming into a fight his enemy had already scouted, timed and positioned against, while he still believed he was hunting. Torpedo Squadron 8 found the Japanese carriers first, at roughly 00:09:18. 15 Devastators, no fighter escort, closing low and slow over open water into a wall of anti-aircraft fire and 0 fighters diving to intercept. Waldron led them in. All 15 aircraft were shot down. Of 30 crewmen, only 1 survived. Ensign George Gay, thrown into the water, who watched the rest of the battle from beneath a floating seat cushion for the better part of a day before he was found. They scored no hits. 2 more torpedo squadrons, from Enterprise and Yorktown, attacked in the following half hour. Of 41 American torpedo planes that flew against the Japanese fleet that morning, 35 did not return, and not one torpedo struck home. Sit with that for a moment. 35 aircraft, most of their crews, an entire tactical arm of the American carrier force, spent for nothing that would appear on any after-action tally as a result. Except one result, no tally captured. Every 0 fighter chasing torpedo planes down to wave-top height was a 0 fighter not at altitude, where the American dive bombers were, at that moment, approaching undetected. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, leading Enterprise's dive bombers, had searched an empty patch of ocean, running low on fuel, with a decision closing in, turn back, or press on and risk ditching at sea. He spotted a lone Japanese destroyer, the Arashi, racing northeast at high speed to rejoin the fleet after holding down an American submarine. McCluskey reasoned that a warship moving fast in open water was heading somewhere, not away from somewhere. He followed the wake. At 1000, he found them. 4 Japanese carriers, decks crowded with fully fueled aircraft and stacked ordnance, still recovering the Midway strike, with almost no fighter cover at altitude to stop what came next. What came next took less than 6 minutes. Dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown arrived nearly simultaneously and unopposed. Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu were each struck by multiple bombs between roughly 122 and 128, their decks packed with fueled aircraft and exposed ordnance, turning each hit into a chain of secondary explosions the Japanese themselves could not contain. Mitsuo Fuchida, who had led the Pearl Harbor strike and was aboard Akagi that morning, recovering from illness, later described the moment in his own account. A lookout screamed, "Hell divers!" I looked up to see 3 black enemy planes plummeting toward our ship. Bombs! Down they came straight toward me. I fell intuitively to the deck and crawled behind a command post mantele. The man who had planned the opening strike of the Pacific War spent its turning point face down on a burning deck, with nothing left to do but wait. Captain Minoru Genda, another of the officers who had helped plan Pearl Harbor, is remembered to have said only one word when he understood what was happening to the fleet. Shimada. We goofed. 2 syllables, from one of the most capable staff officers in the Imperial Navy, standing in for an entire failure of imagination that no operations manual had a chapter for. They had no category for this. Rear Admiral Kusaka, Nagumo's chief of staff, urged him to transfer his flag off the burning Akagi. Nagumo, by several accounts, was reluctant to leave the ship and the men still aboard her. He had commanded the finest carrier strike force ever assembled. In under 10 minutes, most of it no longer existed. This is not a story about one side being brave and the other foolish. Japanese damage control crews fought their burning ships for hours. Japanese pilots who survived the morning flew again that same afternoon. The 4th carrier, Hiryu, still intact, launched 2 strikes within hours of watching her sister ships burn, and hit Yorktown hard enough to leave her dead in the water, seemingly finished. Ask what you would have needed to believe, standing on Akagi's bridge at 10 in the morning, to imagine the war had already turned in under 6 minutes. Nothing in 40 years of doctrine had prepared anyone to believe it that fast. Hiryu did not survive the day. American scout planes found her that afternoon. Dive bombers from Enterprise struck her before dusk, and she sank early the next morning, June 5th. All 4 of Nagumo's fleet carriers, and with them the core of the force that had struck Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier, were gone within 28 hours of the war's most confident naval operation beginning. Yorktown did not sink immediately. Salvage crews kept her afloat, under tow, for 3 more days, until the Japanese submarine I-16-8 found her on June 7th and put 2 torpedoes into her hull. She went down that afternoon, taking the destroyer Hammond, moored alongside her, with her. The record of casualties from those 3 days is precisely tallied on both sides, and worth stating plainly rather than rounding for effect. The United States lost 307 men, 1 carrier, and 1 destroyer. Japan lost approximately 3,057 men, 4 fleet carriers, a heavy cruiser, and 248 aircraft. 3,057. 307. The ratio is not the point. The point is smaller and harder to look at directly. An entire generation of Japan's most experienced carrier mechanics and flight deck crews, the infrastructure that had made those pilots so effective in the first place, went down with their ships in a single morning, and could not be replaced at anything close to the speed at which they had been trained. Yamamoto, when the reports reached his flagship, said little that survives in any documented account. He canceled the invasion and turned the remainder of his fleet for home. Why had Japan's finest naval strategist lost the one thing his entire plan depended on? Not to superior ships, not to superior numbers, which the Americans did not have. He lost it to a handful of men who could finish his sentences before he sent them. This was not a story about equipment, or training, or even about individual skill. The Japanese pilots were superb. Yamamoto was brilliant. Nagumo did exactly what 4 decades of doctrine told a competent officer to do with the information in front of him. None of that was the single factor that did not fit. That factor was a sentence about a water shortage, engineered 8,000 miles from where the bombs eventually fell. Ensign George Gay, the sole survivor of Torpedo Squadron 8, spent nearly 30 hours in the water before a seaplane found him. Decades later, remembering Waldron in an oral history interview, he said, "If I had it all to do over again, even knowing that the odds were going to be like they were, knowing him like I did know him, I'd follow him again through exactly the same thing, because I trusted him very well. Not, I would obey him. Not, I had no choice. Trusted." A survivor's verdict on the man who led 29 other men to their deaths and himself into the water for 30 hours, and the word he reaches for is trust. They had no category, on the Japanese side, for an enemy fleet that already knew the ending. Doctrine assumed surprise was a variable a commander controlled through discipline and security. It had not occurred to combined fleet planners that the enemy might simply take that variable away from them, quietly, months in advance, without firing a shot. The aftermath scattered its principal figures in directions none of them could have predicted that May. Isoroku Yamamoto continued to command the combined fleet for 11 more months. In April 1943, American cryptanalysts, the same discipline that had broken his plan at Midway, decoded his detailed itinerary for an inspection tour of forward bases in the Solomon Islands. On April 18, 1943, American P-38 fighters, flying at the edge of their fuel range from Guadalcanal, intercepted his transport aircraft over Bougainville and shot it down. He died in the wreckage. The code-breaking war that had undone his plan closed his career too, a year later, almost exactly the way it had opened the door to his defeat. Chuichi Nagumo commanded Japanese carriers again, with more success, at Santa Cruz later in 1942. By 1944, he had been reassigned to the Central Pacific Area Fleet, based on Saipan, an island the Imperial Navy no longer had the ships to defend. When American forces overran it in July 1944, Nagumo, with no path to escape, took his own life on the evening of July 6. Joseph Rochefort did not go on to further acclaim. Within weeks of the victory his unit had made possible, Washington's cryptanalytic bureaucracy, resentful of a field station that had outperformed headquarters, moved against him. He was reassigned away from intelligence work entirely, to command a floating dry dock. Nimitz recommended him for the Distinguished Service Medal. The recommendation was quietly blocked, twice, across the following decades, by officers in Washington protecting their own account of who had predicted Midway. Rochefort died in 1976, having received no formal recognition for work historians would later call decisive. In 1986, President Ronald Reagan presented the medal, posthumously, to Rochefort's two children. Their father had been dead for 10 years. This is not a story about a tidy moral, where the deserving are rewarded and the record corrects itself in time to matter to the people who earned it. Institutions do not reliably do that. Sometimes they do it a decade after the man who needed it is in the ground. Nimitz himself went on to accept the Japanese surrender aboard the USS Missouri 3 years later. The phrase from his May orders, the principle of calculated risk, outlived the battle, still taught to American naval officers as a working definition of how a commander reasons under uncertainty that cannot be fully resolved before a decision falls due. Here is the paradox this story leaves open, rather than resolving. Yamamoto built the more elegant plan. He commanded the more experienced pilots. He understood, in the abstract, the war he was fighting better than almost anyone on either side. Nimitz built nothing elegant at all. He read a report about a water shortage that his own staff had manufactured, trusted the men who told him what it meant, and placed a bet he could not fully verify. At a point in the ocean his own fleet had nicknamed for its uncertainty. The trap that closed at Midway was Yamamoto's trap. It simply closed on him. A handful of men in a windowless basement had already finished reading the sentence he had not yet finished writing, and by the time his carriers reached the ocean, he had chosen for his decisive battle. The only thing decisive about it was how completely the outcome had already been decided, weeks earlier, by people he never knew were reading his mail.